Texas Panhandle, 1882. Wind moves through grass that runs for miles. The land breaks into red canyons where springs hide. The horizon sits empty except for cattle and the occasional rider. On paper, the scale is staggering. 879,000 acres held in title, 90,000 cattle wearing the brand, 265 horses in the remuda, claims over 1.5 million acres when lease and range privilege are counted, decades of Scottish capital backing it, $1.25 million changing hands in a single December transaction. Impressive. Yet the ranch never ran itself. Behind the cattle and grass sat a wire that stretched across the Atlantic. Weekly reports to a board in Dundee, accountants tracking every steer, managers in Fort Worth and Trinidad making calls based on numbers that arrived weeks late. Drought could wipe a year's gain. Price swings in Chicago could turn profit into loss overnight. Debt was patient until it was not. One bad winter, one sustained price drop, one creditor demanding settlement. Control shifted. Empire fractured. Did foreign capital and American ambition build something that lasted? Or was the Matador Ranch always a high-stakes bet on land that never quite belonged to anyone for long? If you enjoy deep dives into historic ranch empires, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which ranch I should explore next. Chapter 1. Scottish Money Meets Texas Grass. The partnership began with a successful cattle drive. Henry Campbell and Colonel Alfred Britton met in the late 1870s. Campbell had just pushed a herd north to Chicago and turned a profit large enough to make him think bigger. The drive had been brutal. Weeks on the trail, river crossings that drowned cattle, storms that scattered herds across miles of open country. Cowboys worked 18-hour days, slept on wet ground, and ate beans and hardtack until they were sick of both. But the price at the Chicago yards made the risk worthwhile. Campbell came back to Texas with money and conviction. The northern markets would pay. The question was scale. 1 drive a year was profitable. 10 drives a year could build an empire. Britain brought organizational discipline. He had served in the Confederate Army, learned logistics under pressure, and understood how to manage operations that spanned distance and required coordinating men who operated independently for weeks at a time. He saw what Campbell saw. The Pease River country could support something larger than what most outfits were attempting. The grass was there. The water existed. What was missing was capital and structure. Together, they decided the Pease River country in Motley County offered what they needed: open grass, water at Ballard Springs, distance from settlement. The land sat in the breaks where the caprock began to fracture into canyons, red dirt, juniper in the draws, grass that cured standing through dry months and could carry cattle through winter if the snow was not too deep. 1878, they acquired the base. The transaction was informal by later standards. Cash changed hands. A handshake confirmed range rights that existed more through custom than law. The land office in Austin recorded what could be recorded in fee title. The rest existed as understanding between men who operated by frontier rules. 1879. They organized the Matador Cattle Company, not yet a Scottish empire, not yet a joint stock operation with shareholders in Dundee demanding quarterly reports. Just 2 men claiming range through custom, cash, and fast accumulation of cattle and horses. They bought herds from outfits that were pulling out or downsizing. Small operators who had tried the Panhandle and decided it was too isolated or too risky. Larger outfits shedding divisions to consolidate elsewhere. Campbell and Britton bought cattle in lots of hundreds, sometimes thousands, and pushed them onto Matador Ranch. They hired riders. Cowboys drifted in looking for work. Some stayed a season, some stayed years. The pay was standard for the time. $30 a month, food, a bedroll, a horse to ride. The work was hard, but no harder than other outfits offered. They built crude corrals near the springs, pens made from juniper posts and whatever timber could be hauled in, a dugout for shelter, a stone fireplace. The headquarters was functional, not impressive. The brand went through versions. 50 million at first. Simple to burn, easy to read, but too easy to alter with a running iron heated over a campfire. A rustler could turn the M into other letters with minimal effort, and stolen cattle could disappear into another herd before anyone noticed. Then the Flying Five took hold, clean lines, hard to alter without leaving obvious scars on the hide, easy to spot from distance when cattle bunched in a draw or scattered across open range during roundup. The brand sat high on the left hip, where it would show clearly even on cattle that had gone half wild in the breaks. Campbell and Britton registered it officially with Motley County and began burning it into every hide they controlled. The Matador Five would mark hides for the next 70 years and become one of the most recognized brands in Texas. Britton handled early management from a base that shifted between the ranch and Fort Worth. He kept books in ledgers that recorded every transaction. He negotiated with buyers who came through looking for cattle. He planned shipments to northern markets and calculated margins that had to cover the cost of trailing, shipping, and commission fees. Campbell rode the range. He knew cattle by instinct and experience. He understood grass quality and how it changed with rainfall and season. He could read weather systems building on the horizon and knew when to move herds to shelter and when to leave them in the open. They bought herds, added leases, and expanded through what was then called range privilege, informal but widely recognized across the frontier. You grazed where you could defend your claim. The government owned vast tracts on paper, but had not yet asserted control through surveys, sales, or enforcement. Legal title mattered less than presence and the willingness to protect what you claimed. The strongest outfit controlled the best water and everything that depended on it. Springs were leverage. Creeks were currency. A ranch that held reliable water could push weaker operations out simply by existing and waiting. Cattle drifted to water. Whoever owned the water owned the cattle, eventually, because stock could not survive more than a few days without it in the panhandle climate. Campbell and Britton secured Ballard Springs early and made it the anchor of their operation. They developed other sources as they found them: hand-dug wells, improved springs, small tanks that captured runoff. They watched the country carefully and claimed what others had missed or abandoned after failed attempts. By 1882, the operation had taken shape. Roughly 100,000 acres in fee land, purchased outright and recorded with the state. Claims over 1 million more through lease agreements with the state and through informal range privilege that amounted to occupation and use. 40,000 cattle wearing the Flying V, though the exact count was uncertain because gathering every animal in rough country was impossible. 265 horses in the remuda, used in rotation to keep them fresh and sound. Improvements that included corrals, dugouts, a primitive headquarters near the springs, and enough infrastructure to support year-round operations without depending on seasonal camps. The crew was small but competent, a handful of full-time hands who stayed through winter, seasonal hires during spring and fall roundup when branding and gathering required more men, a cook who worked out of a wagon during roundups and a dugout kitchen the rest of the year, a horse wrangler who managed the remuda and kept the working horses sound, men who could work alone for weeks at a time and not lose focus or discipline. Cowboys who understood that missing cattle or letting fences fall into disrepair meant losses that showed up in the books months later. The scale caught attention in Scotland. Dundee was a city built on jute mills and global shipping. Merchants there had accumulated capital through trade and manufacturing, but faced limited options for deploying it at the returns they wanted. British markets were mature and crowded. Returns on domestic investments were steady but unexciting. American ventures looked more promising. The risks were higher, but so were the potential gains. Railroads, mining operations, land development, and cattle ranching on the open ranges of the American West. Word reached Dundee through financial networks that linked British investors to American opportunities. Brokers moved between continents. Letters carried reports of profits being made in Texas. Newspaper accounts described vast herds and fortunes built from grass and beef. The Matador was not the only operation being watched. British investors had already funded ranches in Wyoming, Montana, and other parts of Texas. But the Matador had advantages that made it attractive. An established base of operations, competent management with proven track records, a brand that was gaining recognition in northern markets, cattle numbers that could be verified, at least approximately, and most importantly, Campbell and Britton were willing to sell. Campbell and Britton wanted to expand faster than their own capital allowed. Buying more land required cash. Increasing the herd required buying more cattle. Developing water and building fences required upfront investment that would not pay back for years. The Scottish wanted access to American beef markets without the complexity of starting an operation from scratch or managing day-to-day ranching from across an ocean. The interests aligned, and Scotland had money to spend. Enough money to turn a frontier partnership into something much larger and much more complicated. Chapter 2. The Dundee Transaction. Dundee merchants had money, but no direct access to American beef markets. American cattle operations had grass and ambition, but needed capital to expand past what local banks would risk. The match was obvious. What was bought and sold in December of 1882 was more than land. The Matador Land and Cattle Company Limited formed in Dundee as a joint stock operation. The structure was formal. A board of directors in Scotland. Shareholders who ranged from wealthy merchants to working-class investors, buying in on the promise of reliable returns from American rangeland. The appeal was broad. Dividends paid in pounds sterling from Texas beef. A chance to participate in the American frontier without leaving Scotland. The marketing emphasized opportunity and downplayed risk. The purchase price was $1.25 million, a staggering sum for the time. More money than most Texans would see in a lifetime, enough to buy entire counties or fund a railroad spur. The transaction represented one of the largest foreign investments in American rangeland during that era. What that bought, 100,000 acres in fee title, claims and leases over roughly 1.5 million more, 40,000 head of cattle, 265 horses, existing improvements that included headquarters buildings and corrals, and the goodwill of an operation already running profitably. What it did not buy, certainty. The land existed under a patchwork of legal theories that would take decades to fully resolve. Fee title was solid where it existed. The state of Texas recognized it. Courts would uphold it. But vast areas remained under competing claims. Range rights were custom. Everyone on the frontier understood them. You used what you could control. But custom was not law. When pressure came, custom gave way to lawyers and surveyors and court judgments. Leases could be challenged. The state held land it had not yet sold. The terms for leasing changed based on politics in Austin. Agreements that looked secure one year could be voided or repriced the next. The federal government had not yet fully sorted out what it controlled in the Texas Panhandle. Surveys were incomplete. Boundaries were disputed. The land office records in Washington often contradicted what the state claimed in Austin. Fencing would soon change the calculus entirely. Barbed wire was just arriving in the Panhandle. Within a decade, the open range would close. What had been claimed through occupation would have to be defended with fence and title. The informal system that Campbell and Britton had navigated was already dying. The Dundee board operated from Scotland. They hired American managers to report weekly. The split was clean on paper. Scottish capital funded operations. American managers made daily decisions. The board reviewed, approved, questioned, and occasionally overruled from thousands of miles away. In practice, the tension never fully left. Decisions about cattle sales, land purchases, and labor costs required approval from men who had never seen Motley County, men who knew finance but not drought, who understood markets but not the difference between good grass and poor, who could read a balance sheet but could not read the sky before a norther blew in. Letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Managers sent reports explaining conditions. The board sent responses questioning expenses. Weeks passed between question and answer. By the time a reply arrived, conditions had often changed. Managers learned to act first and explain later. Campbell stayed on as superintendent. He knew the country. He knew the cattle. He understood how to run the ranch day to day. The board trusted him to manage operations as long as the cattle numbers stayed steady and costs remained within bounds. Britton moved into a broader managerial role. He became the translator between Scotland and Texas. He took Campbell's field reports and turned them into language the board would accept. He took the board's financial concerns and turned them into directives Campbell could implement. The headquarters anchored near the Pease River breaks, rolling grassland with access to springs and creeks, enough shelter in the canyons to protect cattle during winter storms, enough open range to graze them through the warmer months when grass was abundant. Stone buildings would come later. For now, the headquarters was still rough. Dugouts and frame structures, corrals that needed constant repair, a bunkhouse for hands, an office for the superintendent. Nothing grand, but functional. The Scottish era had begun. Capital from Dundee. Management split between Scotland and Texas. Weekly reports crossing the ocean. A joint stock structure imposed on a frontier operation that had grown up under handshake agreements and range custom. The question was how long Scotland could manage Texas from across an ocean, and how long Texas would tolerate being managed by men who had never felt panhandle dust in their throats or watched a drought crack the ground into puzzle pieces. Chapter 3. Pease River Country and the Flying Five. The landscape shaped the operation in ways the Dundee board never fully grasped. Motley County sits where the caprock meets the rolling plains. The elevation drops. The land breaks into a maze of canyons and draws. The Pease River cuts through red dirt and stone, carving deeper channels after every flood. The breaks offered shelter but also hid cattle. Gathering every animal in rough country was impossible. Cowboys rode for days and still missed draws where small bunches had drifted. Outlaws and mavericks survived in the deeper canyons, never branded, never counted, never contributing to the tally the Dundee board expected. Springs seeped through rock in predictable places. Locals knew where to find them. Newcomers had to search or ask. Water was the anchor. Everything else, where you camped, where you grazed, where you built headquarters, depended on reliable water. Creeks ran seasonal. Spring rains filled them. Summer heat dried them. Winter froze them. Only the springs could be trusted year-round, and even those sometimes slowed to a trickle during extended drought. Grass grew thick after rain and cured standing through dry spells. Buffalo grass, grama, side oats, species that had evolved with grazing pressure and knew how to survive. Cattle could graze year-round if water held, and winter did not turn brutal. The headquarters complex grew slowly. Dugouts gave way to frame buildings. Frame buildings gave way to stone. Each upgrade cost money and required approval from Scotland. The board questioned every expenditure. Why stone when frame was cheaper? Why a new bunkhouse when the old one still stood? Managers explained. Stone lasted. Frame rotted. Replacing structures every decade cost more than building right the first time. The board approved reluctantly, line by line, watching costs accumulate. By 1917, the headquarters that still stands today was complete. Stone buildings that could withstand fire and weather, corrals designed for efficient handling, scales and shipping pens positioned near where the railroad would eventually reach. A headquarters built to last generations, paid for by Scottish capital, managed by Texans who would outlive most of the Dundee shareholders. The Flying Five became identity, not just a mark burned into hide, but a system. Every division, every lease, every far-flung pasture tied back to that brand. Riders carried the same iron whether they worked in Motley County or 200 miles away in Oldham. Buyers recognized it. A Matador steer carried reputation. The brand meant consistent quality. Cattle that had been handled properly, branded young, and moved to market at the right weight. Buyers in Chicago and Kansas City paid attention when Matador cattle arrived. Thieves knew altering it meant trouble. The lines were clean and distinctive. Changing a Flying Five into another brand required scarring the hide so badly that the alteration was obvious. Most rustlers looked for easier marks. The geography required constant movement. Cattle did not stay put. They drifted with weather. They sought water during dry spells. They followed grass. They bunched in canyons during storms and scattered across open range when conditions improved. Cowboys rode line to turn strays before they drifted too far. They pushed herds between pastures based on season and grass condition. They gathered cattle for branding in spring and for shipping in fall. The work was repetitive and essential. Miss a drift and cattle ended up on another outfit's range or dead in a draw after a storm. Miss a gather and unbranded calves grew into mavericks that belonged to whoever found them first. Miss a count and the books in Dundee showed losses that managers in Texas had to explain. Water was leverage that shaped everything else. The ranch held springs. It developed wells when technology allowed. Windmills appeared in the 1890s. Metal towers that pulled groundwater from depths hand-dug wells could never reach. Tanks followed, earthen structures that captured runoff and stored it for months. Later, pipelines distributed water to pastures that had been unusable before. Miles of pipe running underground, fed by wells, delivering water to troughs where cattle could drink without concentrating around fragile springs. Control over water meant control over which pastures could carry cattle and for how long. The outfit that dominated water dominated the surrounding grass. It was leverage as old as ranching itself, dressed up in new technology, but unchanged in principle. The Matador expanded its footprint beyond Motley County. Holdings in Cottle, Dickens, Floyd, scattered parcels that filled gaps or secured water. Each purchase required board approval. Each lease required negotiation. The operation sprawled across county lines, connected by brand and management, but separated by distance and terrain. Then came the major push into Oldham County and the Alamositas division. That purchase would reshape the ranch and reveal the limits of growth. But first, the machinery had to be understood. The two-level workforce that made the Scottish system function. Chapter 4. Two-level workforce. The labor split along clear lines that everyone understood, but few discussed openly. Range work meant cowboys. Men who rode fence, branded calves, gathered cattle for shipment, broke horses, and lived in camps scattered across the divisions. They worked on horseback through heat that blistered skin and cold that froze water in canteens. The pay was modest, $30 to $40 a month, depending on skill and seniority. Food came with the job, but the quality varied. Beans, biscuits, bacon when supplies allowed, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Beef, ironically, was not always plentiful. Ranch cattle were inventory, not food. The conditions were rough. Bunkhouses when they existed, bedrolls under the stars more often, dugouts that leaked, frame shacks that let wind through gaps in the boards. Housing was shelter, not comfort. The hierarchy was informal but real. Top hands drew respect based on skill. They could rope anything, ride anything, work longer and harder than younger men. They made decisions in the field that foremen trusted. Their judgment carried weight. Green riders took orders and learned or left. Most left. Ranching was hard work for poor pay and isolation that wore men down. Those who stayed either loved it or had nowhere else to go. Office work meant clerks and accountants stationed at headquarters or in the American manager's office in Fort Worth, later Trinidad, later Denver. Men who sat at desks and produced the weekly reports the Dundee board demanded. Every steer sold had to be logged with date, weight, price, and buyer. Every payroll expense documented with name, position, hours, and rate. Every equipment purchase justified with explanation of need and comparison of prices. The Scottish investors were distant but not passive. They wanted numbers. They cross-referenced reports looking for discrepancies. They questioned expenses that seemed high. They compared Matador performance to other ranches they had heard about or invested in. This dual structure meant managers lived between two worlds. On the range, decisions came fast and were judged by results. A fence line down meant cattle drifted. Fix it now or lose animals. A horse went lame. Replace it from the remuda and keep working. A steer needed doctoring. Rope it, treat it, move on. In the office, decisions moved slowly through correspondence and required explanation that would satisfy men who measured success in ledgers. Why did fence repair cost more this quarter? Because wire prices increased and a storm damaged 3 miles of line. Why were cattle sales delayed? Because market prices were poor and holding for a better price made sense. Why did payroll increase? Because spring branding required hiring seasonal hands and the crew worked longer than projected. The repair cost more and the payroll rose. Murdo Mackenzie, who became manager in 1890 and held influence for years, mastered the balance. He understood cattle. He could ride with the hands and know immediately if grass was good or poor, if cattle were gaining or losing, if the crew was working hard or slacking. He also understood how to frame choices in language the board would accept. He turned field observations into financial arguments. He positioned expenses as investments. He made volatility look like management rather than chaos. Communication discipline was the operating principle that held the system together. Weekly ranch reports went from the headquarters to the American manager's office. Cattle moved, water developed, fences repaired, grass conditions, weather, losses from predators or disease, anything that affected numbers or costs. Monthly summaries went from the American manager to Dundee. Aggregated data, financial performance, comparisons to previous periods, explanations for variances, projections for the coming months. The system functioned because information moved steadily upward even when the news was bad. When it stopped, decisions stalled. A delayed report meant the board made choices based on outdated information. A gap in communication meant questions went unanswered and suspicions grew. Mackenzie and other managers learned that silence was worse than bad news delivered clearly. Hazards were everywhere and constant. Drought hit without warning and lasted as long as it wanted. The 1880s saw dry years. The 1930s would bring dust storms that buried fences and killed cattle where they stood. No amount of Scottish capital could make it rain. Price collapses in distant markets wiped out expected returns. A steer that looked profitable in May could be underwater by September if Chicago buyers decided to wait, or if a competing region flooded the market. Rough country hid cattle that should have been gathered and sold. The breaks and canyons protected mavericks and outlaws. Some animals never saw a branding iron. Others wore brands so old they were unreadable. Losses from missed gathers showed up as phantom inventory that existed on paper but not in pens. Mesquite began invading rangeland in ways that would reshape labor decades later. The brush choked grass and made the work of branding and gathering harder. Cattle hid in thickets. Riders had to push through thorns. Eradication programs would come, but not for years. In the meantime, the brush spread and the costs accumulated. The workforce saw all of it. The men on horseback carried the immediate risk. A thrown rider, a flooded creek, a norther that caught them miles from shelter. Injuries were common. Deaths were less common, but not rare. The work demanded attention and punished mistakes. The men at desks carried the institutional memory and the pressure to explain failure when it came. They tracked patterns across years. They noticed when costs increased or when cattle numbers did not match projections. They had to justify the unjustifiable, drought, market swings, the basic unpredictability of raising animals on open range. Neither role was optional. The ranch needed both. Cowboys who knew cattle and clerks who knew numbers, riders who fixed problems in the field, and accountants who explained those problems to Scotland. Both knew the ranch only functioned when their separate worlds aligned. When the numbers matched the reality on the ground, and the reality on the ground could be translated into numbers the board would accept. Chapter 5. The ranch as supply chain. The Matador did not stop at the Texas border. By the 1890s, the ranch operated a multi-region system that stretched from the Pease River breaks to pastures in South Dakota, Montana, and Canada. This was empire thinking. The ranch was no longer just land and cattle. It was a supply chain. Calves were born and raised in Texas. The climate was right for breeding. Grass was cheap. Water could be developed. Cows dropped calves in spring, and those calves grew on Texas range until they were ready for the next phase. Steers, young males castrated and destined for market, were shipped north to mature in leased pastures where the climate was cooler and the grass was different. The logic was sound. Texas grass was good for growing calves, but northern grass finished cattle better. The cooler climate meant less heat stress. Cattle gained weight more efficiently. They reached market weight faster and in better condition. Cattle were loaded onto trains at Roaring Springs or other shipping points. Rail cars carried them hundreds or thousands of miles. They were unloaded onto northern leases where managers hired locally and reported back to the Matador offices. The northern pastures provided finishing. Steers grazed for months or over a full winter, gaining weight until they were ready for Chicago, Kansas City, or other terminal markets. This was supply chain thinking before the term existed. The Texas range provided the base. The northern pastures provided finishing. The railroad provided connection between the two. Markets in Chicago and beyond provided the cash that justified the entire system. The system worked when all the pieces aligned. Rail rates had to stay reasonable. A spike in shipping costs could wipe out the advantage of northern finishing. The Matador negotiated with railroads constantly, leveraging volume to secure better rates. Lease terms had to hold. Northern landowners saw opportunity in leasing to cattle outfits and sometimes raised prices or sold land out from under the leases. The Matador diversified, holding leases in multiple states to reduce dependence on any single landowner. Markets at the end had to justify the cost of moving cattle thousands of miles. If Chicago prices were strong, the system printed money. If prices fell, every dollar spent on shipping and leasing became a loss. Managing this required coordination across distances that tested communication technology. Steers had to be shipped at the right age. Too young, and they did not gain enough in the north. Too old, and they had already peaked in Texas, and northern finishing added cost without value. Leases had to be renewed on time. Negotiations happened by letter and telegram. Delays meant scrambling to find alternative pastures or shipping cattle back to Texas at a loss. Northern managers had to report conditions so decisions could be made about when to sell or hold. Grass quality, cattle condition, local market rumors, weather forecasts, all of it mattered, and all of it had to flow back to the central decision-makers. The Matador moved information and cattle across vast distances using telegraph, rail, and riders carrying messages between points the wire did not reach. A steer shipped north at 2 years old might not see Texas again. Loaded into rail cars at Roaring Springs, unloaded onto Dakota grass, fattened through a Montana winter, then driven to Chicago pens where men in suits decided its value in minutes. When the system functioned, profits flowed. When one link broke, losses accumulated fast. A delayed shipment could mean cattle arrived at market during a glut. Prices dropped when too many cattle hit the yards at once. Timing mattered as much as quality. A harsh winter in Montana could kill steers before they gained enough weight to justify the investment. Blizzards were unpredictable. Cattle froze in open pastures. Feed ran short. Losses mounted, and there was no recovering the shipping costs or lease payments. A dispute over lease terms could force a scramble for alternative pasture. Landowners sometimes sold to settlers or reneged on verbal agreements. The Matador had to find new leases fast or ship cattle back to Texas, eating costs both ways. The northern operations also created exposure the ranch had not faced before. The ranch was no longer purely Texan. It sat inside webs of obligation that crossed state and national lines. Laws varied, regulations differed. A change in Canadian tariff policy could make leases there uneconomical overnight. Canadian tariffs, enacted after the First World War, did exactly that. Post-war protectionism raised costs on cattle crossing the border. What had been profitable when tariffs were low became marginal or negative when duties increased. The advantage of finishing steers in Canada evaporated. The Matador began pulling back from leases it had held for decades. Cattle that would have gone north stayed in Texas or went to different regions. Costs rose. returns thinned. The rationale for holding mature steers far from headquarters began to erode under pressure the ranch could not control. By the 1920s, the empire phase was contracting. The multi-region system that had defined Matador operations for 30 years was being dismantled, not through failure, but through changing economics. The model that worked in one era stopped working in the next. The question was whether anyone in Dundee understood how fast the world was shifting, and whether the ranch could adapt before the board demanded answers the managers in Texas could not provide. Chapter 6. Fencing, Water, Rail. Infrastructure was power disguised as practicality. The Matador fenced aggressively starting in the 1880s when barbed wire became widely available and affordable. Wire changed everything about how ranches operated. Open range gave way to controlled pastures. Drift stopped. Cattle stayed where they were put. Boundaries hardened from informal custom into physical barriers that even lawyers could understand. The ranch could now manage grazing with precision instead of hope. Pastures could be rested. Grass could recover. Cattle could be rotated through divisions based on forage quality and season. Scientific range management was decades away, but the basic principle was already clear. Control meant efficiency. Fencing cost, money and labor that never stopped. Wire had to be purchased by the ton and hauled to wherever it was needed. Posts had to be cut from local timber or shipped in when timber was scarce. Crews spent weeks stretching wire across miles of pasture, setting posts in rocky ground, pulling wire tight, and stapling it in place. Repairs were constant. Weather broke fences. Cattle pushed through weak spots. Vandals cut wire out of spite or to move stolen cattle. Crews rode line regularly, checking for breaks and fixing them before cattle drifted. The investment was continuous. There was no finishing a fence and walking away. Maintaining fence was permanent work. The return was control, and control was worth paying for. Water development followed the same logic and reshaped the ranch as profoundly as wire. Windmills pumped groundwater where surface springs were absent. Metal towers rose above the plains, their blades turning in constant wind, pulling water from aquifers that had never been tapped before. Tanks stored it, earthen structures shaped like shallow bowls designed to capture rainfall runoff and hold it for months. Some tanks were hand-dug. Others were carved out with mule-drawn scrapers. Later, steam-powered equipment made the work faster. Pipelines distributed water to pastures that had been marginal or unusable. Miles of pipe running underground, fed by wells and windmills, delivering water to troughs strategically placed across the range. Each improvement extended the ranch's effective range. Pastures that had been too dry to carry cattle year-round could now support herds through summer. Divisions that had depended on seasonal creeks could now operate regardless of rainfall. The ranch's carrying capacity increased without buying more land. Cattle that would have concentrated near creeks and springs, overgrazing those areas and leaving distant grass unused, could now be spread across divisions more evenly. The Quanah, Acme, and Pacific Railroad ran through the ranch and changed the economics of shipping. Before rail, cattle were trailed to market or to shipping points hundreds of miles away. Trail drives took weeks. Cattle lost weight. Some died. Costs accumulated daily. The QA and P line reached close enough to matter. Row-ales meant access to markets without the punishing cost of long drives. Shipment could be loaded and shipped within days of being gathered. Time from range to terminal collapsed. Shipping costs replaced trail expenses, and while rail was not cheap, it was faster and more reliable. Loading day meant dust, noise, and cattle pushed up chutes into cars that rocked and creaked under the weight. Cowboys worked the pens, sorting animals and pushing them toward the chutes. The locomotive sat waiting, steam hissing. The agent checked his watch and his manifest. Roaring Springs became a node in the Matador system, a depot where cattle were loaded and supplies were unloaded, pens and a scale house where animals were weighed and counted before shipment. Eventually, a small settlement grew around the depot, a store, a hotel, a few houses. The town owed its existence to the railroad and the ranch. When the ranch was strong and shipping heavily, the town hummed. The depot was busy, the hotel filled with buyers and commission agents. Money moved through local businesses. When cattle numbers dropped or the ranch shipped elsewhere, Roaring Springs thinned, businesses closed, people left. The town's fortune was tied directly to Matador operations. This was leverage in both directions. The railroad needed the ranch's business. Shipping thousands of cattle generated revenue the QA&P depended on. The Matador was one of the line's largest customers. The ranch needed the railroad's access. Without rail, the cost of reaching markets would have been prohibitive. The value of the ranch's cattle depended on being able to move them efficiently. Neither could operate at full capacity without the other. Negotiations over rates and schedules carried weight because both sides had something to lose. The Matador pushed for lower rates and priority scheduling. The railroad pushed back, but knew losing the Matador's business would hurt. The balance shifted over time as other ranches also gained rail access and the Matador's leverage decreased. But in the early decades, the relationship defined regional economics. Infrastructure also meant vulnerability that accumulated with every mile of fence and pipe. A pump failure during drought could cost cattle. If windmills stopped turning or wells ran dry, cattle concentrated around remaining water sources. Overgrazing destroyed grass. Weak animals died. The losses compounded. A fence break during a storm could scatter a herd across county lines. Gathering cattle after a major drift took days and often failed to recover every animal. What should have been secured behind wire ended up mixed with other herds or lost entirely. A delayed train could mean arriving at market during a price drop. Timing was everything in cattle markets. Arriving a week late could mean the difference between profit and loss. The ranch depended on railroads keeping schedules they did not always keep. The systems that made the ranch efficient also created dependencies the ranch could not eliminate. The Matador spent relentlessly on improvements, not because managers were reckless or because the board encouraged spending. The opposite. Every expenditure was questioned and justified, but standing still meant falling behind. Competitors fenced, competitors drilled wells, competitors built access to rail. To remain competitive required matching every advance and finding the next one first. Technology moved faster than budgets. Windmills improved, barbed wire came in better grades, pipelines became feasible. Each innovation promised efficiency but demanded capital. The bills piled up accordingly: fence maintenance, well repair, pipeline extensions, equipment replacement. The costs never stopped and only increased as the ranch grew, and every unpaid invoice was a question the Dundee board would eventually ask. The board wanted predictability. The range refused to provide it. One winter could rewrite the books. So what did they do when the numbers stopped cooperating? The answers were sound but repetitive, because the alternative was falling behind, because technology changed, because the ranch competed with operations that were also modernizing. The board approved most requests eventually, but the friction was constant. Scotland wanted returns. Texas needed investment. The tension shaped every decision about how fast to modernize and how much to spend. Chapter 7, Alamositas and the Ex-IT Purchase, 1902. The Matador moved west into Oldham County in one of the largest single land acquisitions in its history. The purchase was massive, roughly 210,000 acres of former XYT land. The XYT, once the largest fenced ranch in the world, was selling divisions to pay off the Texas state capital debt it had been created to settle. The ranch was breaking itself apart. The Matador bought one of those pieces. The division was named Alamositas. The name meant little cottonwoods in Spanish, a reference to trees that grew along the few creeks in that dry country. This was empire building at its most aggressive. The addition pushed the ranch's Texas footprint toward 900,000 acres in total title holdings. When leases and range privileges were counted, the operation claimed control over an area that stretched across multiple counties and exceeded the size of Rhode Island. The Matador was no longer a ranch. It was a land company that happened to raise cattle. Alamositas brought its own challenges that the Dundee board did not fully anticipate. The land was drier than Motley County. Rainfall was less reliable. Grass was sparser. The country was flatter and more exposed to wind. Summers were brutal. Winters were harsh. The range was unforgiving. Water development was essential and expensive. Wells had to be drilled immediately. The division could not carry cattle without developed water. Hand-dug wells were insufficient. Drilled wells with windmills were the only solution, and drilling was costly and uncertain. Crews sank wells that came up dry. They drilled deeper and hit water that was too alkaline for cattle. They finally found good water and immediately had to install windmills, tanks, and piping to distribute it. Fencing followed as fast as wire could be hauled in. The division required its own perimeter fence to keep Matador cattle in and neighboring stock out. Interior fences divided the land into manageable pastures. Miles and miles of wire stretched across Oldham County at costs that made the Dundee board question the purchase. The division required its own headquarters, its own crew, and its own management layer. A superintendent to oversee day-to-day operations, cowboys to work the cattle, a cook, a horse wrangler, clerks to keep records. Buildings had to be constructed, corrals built, supply lines established. Alamositas operated almost as a separate ranch, connected to the main Matador operation by brand and ownership, but functioning independently in practice. The expansion also revealed a limit the ranch had not fully confronted before. The larger the ranch grew, the harder it became to manage as a single unit. Divisions operated semi-independently because they had to. The distance between Motley County and Oldham County was significant. Travel took days. Communication relied on letters and occasional visits. Day-to-day decisions had to be made locally. Reports flowed upward, but decisions lagged. A problem in Alamositas could not wait for instructions from headquarters. The division superintendent had to act and report later. The distance between the Dundee board and the Texas grass widened with every acre added. Scotland was already thousands of miles from Motley County. Adding Oldham County meant the board was now trying to manage operations across an even larger geographic spread. Reports took longer to compile. Decisions required coordination across more people. The system began to strain under its own complexity. Still, the move made strategic sense at the time when the decision was made. Cattle prices were strong in the early 1900s. The multi-region system with northern leases was functioning profitably. Expanding the Texas base allowed the ranch to hold more breeding stock and send more steers north for finishing. The XIT land was available. Other outfits were interested. If the Matador did not buy, a competitor would. The board saw opportunity and approved the purchase. The investment looked sound on paper. Land was cheap by historical standards. Cattle numbers could increase. Revenue would follow. The question was whether it could be sustained, whether the ranch had the management capacity to run operations scattered across hundreds of miles, whether the infrastructure investment would pay back before market conditions changed, whether the Dundee board had the patience to wait for returns that might take years, or whether the ranch had just bought itself a decade of costs it could not carry. The bills from Alamositas started arriving almost immediately. Well drilling, fence construction, building materials, wages for a larger crew, equipment, supplies. The division would not turn profitable for years. In the meantime, it drained capital and demanded attention the rest of the ranch also needed. The Matador had reached its maximum extent. From this point forward, the story would be about managing what had been acquired, not adding more. The Empire phase had peaked. Chapter 8. Market Squeeze and Coordination Fears. The late 1880s and into the 1890s brought pressure that tested every assumption the Matador had operated under. Cattle prices weakened across the board. The boom years after the Civil War, when beef demand seemed limitless and prices climbed steadily, were cooling. The market was maturing. Supply began to outrun demand. Ranchers who had expanded aggressively during the boom found themselves holding cattle they could not sell at a profit. Some held anyway, hoping prices would recover. Others flooded the market, which drove prices down further. The Matador was not immune. Reports from Chicago and Kansas City terminals showed prices falling month after month. Cattle that should have brought $18 per head were selling for $15, then $12. The margin between what it cost to raise a steer and what the market would pay kept shrinking. Complaints about the beef ring circulated widely among ranchers and became a fixation. The term referred to the handful of large meat packers who dominated processing and distribution. Swift, Armour, Morris. A few companies controlled access to urban markets where most beef was sold. Ranchers accused these packers of coordinating to suppress prices at the ranch gate. The accusation was that packers shared information about who was shipping what and when, then collectively lowballed bids, knowing ranchers had few alternatives. Whether the coordination was real, provable collusion, or simply the natural result of a concentrated industry hardly mattered to ranchers. The effect was the same. Producers felt powerless. Prices at auction floors swung violently based on timing and volume. A ranch that shipped during a week when multiple large herds arrived would see bids crater. A ranch that somehow avoided the crush could get decent prices, but predicting timing was guesswork. A few large packers controlled access to processing and retail. They owned the packing houses. They controlled the refrigerated rail cars. They had exclusive contracts with urban butchers and grocers. Ranchers had limited options. Sell to the packers at their price, or do not sell at all. The Chicago stockyards smelled of manure, steam, and blood. Pens stretched for blocks, filled with cattle from across the country. Buyers walked the alleys with notebooks, marking prices that changed by the hour. A Matador steer stood in a pen with hundreds of others, stripped of the context that had shaped it, the grass, the water, the years. The Matador sold through commission agents in Chicago and Kansas City who took fees for facilitating sales. The agents took fees, typically a percentage of the sale price. The packers set bids based on weight, condition, and their assessment of market conditions. The railroad charged transport based on distance and volume. By the time a steer left the Pease River and ended up as beef in a market stall or restaurant, the ranch's margin had been whittled by multiple hands taking cuts. This created tension with the Dundee board that played out in every monthly report. Shareholders expected returns. They had invested in American cattle with the promise of reliable dividends. Falling cattle prices meant falling dividends or no dividends at all. Managers in America explained volatility. They laid out the market conditions, the packer power, the timing issues. They argued that the ranch was performing as well as could be expected under circumstances beyond its control. The board pressed for higher sales volumes. If prices per head were falling, sell more head to make up the difference. Ship more cattle. Move inventory faster. Managers warned that flooding the market would depress prices further. If everyone tried to sell more to compensate for lower prices, the glut would worsen, and prices would fall even more. The cycle repeated in letter after letter. Board pressure, manager resistance, compromise that satisfied no one. Mackenzie became skilled at managing these conversations in ways that kept the board from panicking while giving managers room to operate. He framed decisions in terms the board understood. He emphasized long-term stability over short-term gains. He positioned the Matador as better managed than competitors, which was true, but also strategic messaging. He pushed back when pressure from Scotland risked undermining operations in Texas. He explained market realities in language that financial men could grasp. He compared Matador performance to other ranches, often favorably, even when absolute numbers were poor. His influence kept the outfit intact through periods when other ranches fragmented or sold out under similar pressure. But the underlying problem remained, and no amount of skilled communication could eliminate it. The Matador was a price taker, not a price maker. It could control costs by managing operations efficiently. It could improve the quality of cattle through better breeding and handling. It could time sales to avoid the worst market gluts. But it could not dictate what Chicago buyers would pay. It could not force packers to compete. It could not eliminate the fundamental imbalance of power between producers scattered across the West and processors concentrated in a few cities. That vulnerability would grow sharper over time as the industry consolidated further and ranchers lost what little leverage they had once possessed. And when prices collapsed in earnest during future downturns, the weekly reports would carry a different tone. Not just concern, but alarm. Not just explanations, but requests for patience the board might not be willing to grant. Chapter 9. Mackenzie's Hand. Mackenzie became manager in 1890 and shaped the Matador's trajectory for decades. He was Scottish by birth, raised in Rossshire in the Highlands. He emigrated to America as a young man, learned ranching in the American West, and brought a perspective shaped by both cultures. He understood cattle from experience, not theory. He had worked on ranches before managing them. He knew the difference between good grass and poor, between cattle that would finish well and those that would not, between men who could handle the work and those who would fold under pressure. He also understood finance and the politics of managing a transatlantic operation where the people signing checks had never seen the country where the money was spent. That combination was rare and valuable. Mackenzie operated from offices that shifted as the ranch's needs changed. Fort Worth at first, when proximity to Texas operations mattered most. Then Trinidad, Colorado, when the northern leases required more attention, and Trinidad sat at a rail junction that connected Texas to Montana and beyond. Eventually Denver, when the ranch's financial operations demanded access to a larger commercial center. The distance from the ranch headquarters was intentional. He needed proximity to rail hubs where cattle were shipped and received. He needed access to telegraph lines for fast communication with Chicago markets and Dundee offices. He needed to be in cities where buyers, bankers, and other ranch managers gathered to exchange information. The headquarters in Motley County ran day-to-day operations under a superintendent who reported to Mackenzie. Cowboys worked the range, clerks kept local records, but strategic decisions, what to buy, what to sell, when to ship, how to respond to board concerns, came from Mackenzie. His strength was communication, and he wielded it like a tool. The decisions were strategic. The weekly reports to Dundee became more than paperwork. They were narratives carefully constructed to explain conditions, justify decisions, and shape expectations before problems became crises. When drought hit, Mackenzie framed it as a manageable setback, not a catastrophe. He compared it to previous dry spells the ranch had survived. He outlined steps being taken to mitigate losses. He positioned the ranch as better prepared than competitors. When prices fell, he positioned the Matador as strategically holding cattle for better markets while competitors panicked and sold at a loss. He emphasized quality over volume. He reminded the board that short-term price swings mattered less than long-term herd value. When the board questioned expenses, and they questioned constantly, he broke down costs in ways that made spending look like prudent investment rather than waste. Fence repair was not just expense, it was protecting inventory from drift and theft. Water development was not just cost, it was expanding carrying capacity and reducing dependence on unreliable surface sources. Increased payroll during Roundup was not inefficiency, it was the minimum crew needed to gather, brand, and ship cattle on schedule. Mackenzie turned every expense into a story the board could accept. He also pushed for diversification and expansion when he thought the ranch could handle it. The northern pastures in South Dakota, Montana, and Canada were largely his idea. He saw the advantage of finishing steers on cooler grass and argued that the investment in leases would pay back through better cattle prices. He was right for years. The northern system worked well when tariffs were low and prices were strong. Expanding into Canada made sense when tariffs were minimal and grass was cheap. Mackenzie negotiated leases personally, traveling to meet landowners and inspect pastures before committing Matador capital. The Alamositas purchase in Oldham County happened under his watch. He evaluated the XIT land, ran numbers on development costs, and recommended the acquisition to the board. He saw opportunity where others saw risk. Mackenzie was not infallible, and some of his decisions aged poorly. The northern leases became liabilities when economics shifted after the First World War. Canadian tariffs made those pastures unprofitable. The cost of maintaining leases across multiple states grew as operations scaled and coordination became more complex. Expansion increased fixed costs at a time when revenue was uncertain. Alamositas required years of investment before turning profitable. The timing was unlucky. Had prices remained strong, the division would have paid back faster. But Mackenzie's instinct was usually sound, and his ability to manage the board's expectations was exceptional. He kept the ranch solvent through multiple downturns when other operations collapsed. He maintained relationships with the Dundee board even when results disappointed. He handed over an operation that was still functioning when many of his contemporaries had folded or sold. His influence lasted beyond his tenure. The systems he put in place, detailed reporting, cost discipline, strategic timing of sales, diversification across regions, became standard practice at the Matador. Later managers inherited his template and followed it because it worked. The ranch survived the transition from open range to fenced pastures, from trail drives to rail shipping, from frontier operation to corporate enterprise, partly because Mackenzie built structures that outlasted individuals. He understood that managing money across an ocean required more than honesty. It required trust built through consistency, and trust required transparency, even when the news was bad. When drought devastated the herd, Mackenzie reported it fully and outlined recovery plans. When prices collapsed, he did not hide losses but explained them in context. When expenses spiked, he justified them before the board could object. That transparency built credibility. The board knew Mackenzie would tell them the truth, which meant they could trust his recommendations even when conditions were uncertain. Other managers might have hidden problems until they became crises. Mackenzie surfaced problems early when they could still be managed. That difference kept the board patient through difficult periods. His legacy was institutional survival during an era when most cattle ranches failed or were absorbed into larger operations. The Matador outlasted the boom, outlasted the bust, outlasted the transition from open range to modern ranching. Mackenzie's hand was on the wheel for much of that journey. Chapter 10. Climate and Brush. Drought was always a threat, but it came in cycles that tested memory and broke patterns. The Panhandle ran on rainfall that was never guaranteed. Wet years brought thick grass and fat cattle and profits that made expansion look wise. Dry years brought dust and death and bills that wiped out the gains from good years. The ranch adapted by holding reserves when it could. Cash reserves in good years to cover costs in bad. Cattle reserves, keeping breeding stock even when market prices tempted selling everything. It developed water infrastructure to reduce dependence on rainfall. Wells and windmills could produce when surface sources failed. Pipelines distributed groundwater across pastures that would otherwise dry up. It culled herds aggressively before conditions turned catastrophic. Better to sell cattle at a slight loss than to watch them starve or die of thirst when drought deepened. But adaptation had limits that drought tested repeatedly. The 80s saw dry spells that reduced carrying capacity and forced the ranch to limit expansion plans. Grass did not recover as fast as projected. Cattle could not be held in numbers the ranch wanted. The 1910s brought another round of dry years that coincided with falling prices and created a financial squeeze. Low rainfall meant fewer cattle. Low prices meant less revenue per head. The combination was brutal. The 1930s hit harder than anything the ranch had experienced. Dust storms darkened skies across the Panhandle. Wind lifted topsoil and carried it for hundreds of miles. Fences disappeared under drifts of dust. Cattle choked on air thick with dirt. Tanks dried up. Springs that had run for decades slowed to trickles or stopped entirely. Wells had to be drilled deeper. Some came up dry. Others hit water that was increasingly alkaline and barely drinkable. Grass withered and did not recover when rain finally came. The soil had been damaged. Erosion was severe. What had been productive range was degraded to marginal pasture. Cattle lost weight despite everything the ranch tried. Hay had to be purchased and hauled in, an expense that destroyed margins. Weak animals died in place. Cowboys found carcasses in draws where cattle had gathered seeking shelter. The ranch borrowed to stay operational. Lines of credit that had been unnecessary in good years became essential. Interest payments joined the list of fixed costs that had to be met regardless of revenue. Austerity measures followed. Expenses were trimmed everywhere possible. Crews were cut. Seasonal hands were not hired. Full-time hands were let go. The remaining crew worked longer hours covering work that used to require more men. Non-essential repairs were deferred. Fence that could wait another season waited. Buildings that needed paint or new roofs were left as they were. Only critical infrastructure, water systems, corrals, headquarters buildings, received maintenance. Some pastures were abandoned temporarily. Cattle were concentrated where water still existed. Divisions that had been productive were left empty, the grass gone, the costs of maintaining them unjustifiable. The weekly reports to Dundee turned grim. Losses from drought, losses from low prices, borrowing to cover operating costs. The numbers were honest, and they were painful. The decade tested every system the outfit had built. The infrastructure that had looked like prudent investment suddenly looked like overhead the ranch could not afford. Miles of fence to maintain when there was no money for wire, windmills to repair when parts had to be ordered from distant suppliers, wells that needed work when the crew had been cut to minimum size. The diversification across regions that had spread risk now spread costs. The northern leases still required payments, even though cattle numbers were down. The Alamositas division still demanded attention, even though it was not profitable. The Matador survived, but the scars remained. When rain finally came in the late 1930s, the ranch began recovery, but it was slow. Wells that had gone dry during the drought had to be re-drilled. New sources had to be found. The old springs that had anchored the operation for 50 years were no longer reliable. Fences that had not been maintained had to be rebuilt. Wire that had been stretched in the 1880s and patched repeatedly finally had to be replaced entirely. The cost was staggering. Cattle numbers took a decade to recover fully. Rebuilding the herd meant holding heifers instead of selling them. It meant buying bulls to maintain genetics. It meant years of investing before the herd reached the size and quality it had been before the drought. Mesquite invasion added a slower pressure that changed the nature of range work. Brush that had been manageable in the 1880s spread aggressively through the 1920s and beyond. Mesquite choked out grass. It provided cover for cattle that should have been gathered and shipped. It made every aspect of working cattle harder. Branding became more difficult. Calves hid in thickets. Cowboys had to push through thorns to find them. Cattle scattered into brush when pressured and refused to move to open country. Gathering for shipment required more time and more riders. Animals that had once been visible from a distance now disappeared into mesquite stands. Mist gathers became common. Cattle that should have been sold stayed on the range for another year, eating grass and providing no return. Eradication programs began eventually, but progress was slow. Crews cut brush by hand, back-breaking work that barely kept pace with new growth. Controlled burns were introduced, clearing large areas at once, but requiring careful planning to avoid disaster. Herbicides arrived later and made eradication more efficient, but the cost was constant. Brush control became a permanent budget line, work that never finished because mesquite never stopped trying to reclaim the range. The fight against mesquite became a permanent part of the operation, another cost that ate into margins and required constant attention. Climate forced choices the ranch would rather not have made. Brush forced labor expenses that reduced profit. Together, they reshaped what it meant to run a cattle operation in the Panhandle. The natural world did not negotiate. It imposed terms. The ranch either adapted or failed. Most years, it adapted. Some years, it barely survived. A few years, it did not survive unchanged. The ranch that emerged from the 1930s was leaner, tougher, and less confident that good years would always return. Chapter 11. The North Pasture. Model Breaks. The First World War changed markets in ways that broke the Matador's multi-region model. Beef demand spiked during the conflict as governments requisitioned meat to feed armies. American beef went to Europe in massive quantities. Prices rose accordingly. Ranches that had struggled in the 1910s suddenly made money. The Matador sold heavily during the war years and made strong returns. Cattle that had been worth $12 per head in 1914 were worth $25 or $30 by 1917. The ranch shipped everything it could gather and still could not meet demand. Then the war ended in November of 1918. Demand dropped almost immediately. European governments stopped buying. American military contracts ended. The market that had absorbed every steer the ranch could ship suddenly did not need them. Prices followed demand downward. $25 steers became $18 steers, then $15, then $12 again. Within a year, prices had fallen back to pre-war levels or below. The northern pastures, which had been profitable when margins were wide and prices were strong, became liabilities when margins thinned and prices fell. Leases still cost the same. Rail shipping still cost the same. Labor costs had actually increased during the war as workers found better-paying jobs in cities and factories. But revenue per steer had collapsed. The math no longer worked. Canadian tariffs made things worse and accelerated the collapse of the northern system. Post-war protectionism swept across North America. Countries that had cooperated during the war now competed. Canada raised tariffs on American cattle to protect domestic producers. What had been a minimal cost became a significant expense. Steers shipped to Canadian pastures now faced duties that ate into already thin margins. The advantage of finishing cattle in Canada evaporated. The ranch began pulling back from leases it had held for decades. Agreements that had been renewed automatically for years were allowed to lapse. Pastures in Alberta and Saskatchewan that had been central to Matador operations were abandoned. The same process played out in Montana and South Dakota, though for different reasons. The cost of leasing remained high while cattle prices fell. Local landowners saw opportunity in selling to settlers rather than leasing to cattle outfits. Access to pastures the Matador had depended on became uncertain or disappeared entirely. Consumer preference also shifted in ways that undermined the long-cycle model. Demand moved toward younger baby beef instead of older, heavier steers. Urban consumers wanted tender meat from animals slaughtered at 18 to 24 months, not the tougher meat from steers finished at 3 or 4 years. The multi-year cycle of raising cattle in Texas and maturing them in the north no longer matched what buyers wanted. Markets were paying premiums for younger cattle and discounting older ones. Feedlots, closer to packing plants, started to dominate the finishing phase. These operations bought young cattle, fed them grain and silage for a few months to add weight quickly, and shipped directly to nearby packing houses. The feedlot system was faster, more controlled, and better matched to the baby beef market. The long-distance model that had defined the Matador's supply chain since the 1890s became inefficient compared to feedlots. Rail costs, lease costs, and the time cattle spent in transit all worked against the ranch. Ranch responded by consolidating operations and abandoning the empire model. It focused on Texas. The northern leases were allowed to end. Cattle that would have been shipped north stayed in Texas or went to feedlots that could finish them faster. It shifted toward cow-calf production and stockers instead of holding cattle through full maturity. The ranch would raise calves, sell them as yearlings or young steers, and let feedlots or other buyers finish them. The change was gradual but irreversible. Each year, fewer cattle went north. Each year, more were sold locally or to feedlots. By the mid-1920s, the northern system that had operated for 30 years was effectively over. Empire phase was over. What remained was still substantial by any measure. Hundreds of thousands of acres in Texas, tens of thousands of cattle, a brand that carried weight in markets from Kansas City to Chicago, infrastructure that had taken decades to build. But the vision of a seamless operation stretching from the Pease River to the Canadian plains, moving cattle through a coordinated multi-region supply chain, was abandoned. Economics no longer supported it. The market had shifted. Consumer preferences had changed. Post-war trade policies had made cross-border operations prohibitively expensive. And the Dundee board, reading reports of shrinking operations and rising costs, began to ask whether the economics supported continuing at all, whether the ranch could be profitable at the smaller scale it was being forced to accept, whether Scottish capital was still finding adequate returns, whether the entire investment had been a bet on a moment in history that had passed. The answers would come in the 1950s, when the board finally decided it had waited long enough. Chapter 12. Dissolution and the Lazard Sale, 1951. Lazard Freres, the investment banking firm, acquired more than 90% of the Matador Land and Cattle Company shares. The transaction marked the end of the Scottish era and the beginning of dissolution. The decision to sell came from shareholders in Dundee who had held the stock for decades, some since the original 1882 offering. Their patience had run out. Returns had thinned over the years. Dividends that had once been reliable became sporadic. The ranch still operated and still generated revenue, but the profit margins were nothing like the early years. What had been sold as a high-return investment in American frontier opportunity had become a mature, low-return holding in an industry that was consolidating and changing. The operation felt increasingly distant and difficult to understand. Reports came from Texas, but the board in Scotland had long since lost direct knowledge of ranching. The men who had invested in 1882 were dead. Their children and grandchildren held the shares now, and to them the Matador was just one investment among many. Better to liquidate and move capital elsewhere. Real estate, manufacturing, industries that were growing in post-war Britain. Anything that promised more return than cattle ranching in Texas. Lazard Freres saw opportunity in breaking up what the Scots had held together. The investment firm acquired the controlling interest not to run a cattle ranch, but to dismantle it profitably. Land could be sold to buyers who wanted to ranch smaller operations. Cattle could be auctioned. Equipment could be liquidated. The brand could be sold along with whatever division wanted to keep using it. The sale triggered formal dissolution of the joint stock company. The Matador Land and Cattle Company, Limited, which had existed since December 1882, was wound down. Assets were inventoried. Liabilities were settled. What remained was divided and sold. Land, cattle, horses, and equipment were auctioned to multiple buyers over the course of 1951 and into 1952. Some divisions stayed together. Others were broken into smaller parcels. Buyers ranged from established ranchers expanding their operations to newcomers trying to start fresh. The Flying Five brand split among new owners. Some divisions kept using it under license or agreement. Others adopted new brands. The unity that had existed under Scottish ownership fragmented into independent operations that happened to share a common history. This was not collapse, it was planned dismantling. Assets were sold at fair value to buyers who intended to keep ranching. Lazard Freres made a profit on the transaction. Shareholders received payouts that closed their investment, finally, after nearly 70 years. The land remained productive. Cattle still grazed the Pease River breaks and the Alamositas plains. Cowboys still worked the range, but the structure that had governed it all was gone. For the Dundee investors, the outcome was mixed. Early shareholders, those who had bought in during the 1880s and held through the profitable years, had done well overall. Dividends in good years had exceeded the returns available from British investments. The final liquidation payout was acceptable, if not spectacular. Later shareholders, those who had inherited shares or bought them second-hand during the early 1900s, had seen lower returns. The ranch had been profitable, but not consistently. Dividends had been suspended during drought years and low-price periods. The final payout barely covered inflation over the decades they had held. For the people on the ground in Texas, the change was immediate and uncertain. New owners meant new management. Some hands stayed on under different bosses. Their skills were valuable, and the new owners needed experienced cowboys who knew the country and the cattle. Others were let go as new owners brought in their own crews or decided to run leaner operations. Layoffs were handled with varying levels of consideration. Some received severance or help finding work elsewhere. Others were simply told their services were no longer needed. The headquarters division, the symbolic heart of the operation where the stone buildings still stood, passed to new ownership as a single unit. That division would soon have a new owner with deep pockets and a long-term vision. Fred C. Koch was waiting. He had been watching the Matador situation and saw opportunity in what others saw as the end. Chapter 13. Fred C. Koch and Corporate Transition, 1952. Fred Koch acquired the headquarters division and additional Matador holdings from the buyers who had purchased them during the Lazard sale. He consolidated what he wanted and incorporated the Matador Cattle Company as a private operation. The transition from Scottish Joint Stock Company to American Private Corporation was complete. Koch was not a rancher by background. He had made his fortune in petroleum engineering, developing processes for refining oil. He had capital, business acumen, and an interest in land that went beyond simple investment returns. He brought a different philosophy to the ranch. The operation would continue as a working cattle ranch, not a showpiece or a tax shelter, but a productive business. It would be run under tighter private control, without the burden of distant shareholders demanding quarterly explanations. Reporting to Scotland ended. No more weekly reports crossing the Atlantic. No more justifying every expense to a board in Dundee. Decisions could be made locally and quickly based on what the ranch needed rather than what distant investors would accept. The bureaucracy thinned accordingly. The American manager's office that had existed in Denver to coordinate between Texas and Scotland was no longer necessary. Management consolidated at the ranch headquarters. The superintendent reported directly to Koch or his designated representatives. Paperwork decreased. The detailed accounting that had satisfied Scottish shareholders was replaced with simpler internal reporting. The ranch still tracked costs and revenue, but without the elaborate justifications that had been required under the old system. Under Koch ownership, the ranch emphasized land stewardship in ways that aligned with emerging conservation thinking. Brush control programs intensified. Mesquite that had been spreading for decades was targeted aggressively. Crews used mechanical methods, chemical herbicides, and prescribed burns to reclaim rangeland that had been degraded. Prescribed burns became routine rather than emergency measures. Controlled fires cleared dead vegetation, stimulated new grass growth, and reduced the fuel load that could feed wildfires. The practice required fire and careful skill, but proved effective. Water development continued and accelerated. New wells were drilled using modern equipment. Pipelines extended to pastures that had never been reliably watered. Tanks were improved and expanded. The ranch's carrying capacity increased as more land became usable year-round. Wildlife management was added as a formal component of operations. Deer, quail, turkey, and other species were tracked and monitored. Habitat improvements benefited both wildlife and cattle. Hunting leases brought in revenue that supplemented cattle sales and provided income during lean years when cattle prices were poor. The ranch began marketing itself as a model of range stewardship, demonstrating that productive ranching and conservation could coexist. The remuda, the working horse herd, was maintained and reportedly earned awards for quality. Koch invested in breeding and training programs. The Matador horses became known for soundness, intelligence, and working ability. They were used throughout the ranch operations and also sold to other outfits that valued quality mounts. Awards followed from breed associations and ranching organizations. The horses became a point of pride and a marketing asset. Buyers knew that a horse from the Matador remuda had been bred for work and trained properly. The revenue stack diversified beyond cattle. Cow-calf operations and stockers remained the core. The ranch raised calves, sold them as yearlings or young steers, and reinvested in breeding stock. This was traditional ranching, and it remained the foundation. Horses added value both through sales and through improved ranch operations. Better mounts made cowboys more productive. Hunting brought in seasonal income from leases and guide services. Wealthy sportsmen paid to hunt on the ranch, and that income came without selling land or depleting cattle numbers. Later, lodging and guest stays were introduced. People who wanted to experience ranch life could book stays at the headquarters. They saw working operations, learned about ranching, and paid for the privilege. The ranch gained revenue and positive publicity. The operation stayed profitable without the boom and bust extremes of the Scottish era. No distant shareholders demanding dividends regardless of drought or market conditions. No pressure to expand into unprofitable regions just to show growth. No complex reporting structure that absorbed management time and energy. The ranch existed at a sustainable scale, doing what it had always done, raising cattle on Texas grass, but with modern tools, broader income streams, and private ownership that allowed long-term thinking. The Koch era lasted nearly 70 years, longer than the Scottish period. During that time, the ranch remained in family hands, managed conservatively, and avoided the financial crises that had broken other historic outfits. The brand continued. The headquarters stood. The land was worked by people who understood it. But nothing lasts unchanged. By the second decade of the 21st century, the family had different priorities. The next generation saw opportunities elsewhere. The ranch, for all its history and productivity, was no longer central to family strategy. And by 2020, another transition was already forming. Chapter 14. The Priceline Moment. 1934. Summer in the Panhandle. Dust hangs in the air even when the wind is calm. The sky is white with suspended dirt. Visibility drops to a few hundred yards on bad days. Cowboys tie bandanas over their faces and still breathe dust. The tanks are low. Some are completely dry, showing cracked mud where water should be. Others hold a few feet of water that cattle have trampled into muddy soup, barely drinkable. Springs that have run for decades slow to trickles or stop entirely. The seeps in the canyons that used to provide reliable water are dry. Cowboys ride miles to find water and sometimes do not find enough. cattle bunch near the few springs that still flow. Hundreds of animals concentrated in areas that should hold dozens. The grass around the water is trampled to bare ground. Cattle stand in the sun waiting for a chance to drink. The windmills turn when wind blows, but some wells are pumping less than before. The water table has dropped. Pumps pull harder for less flow. A few wells that produced reliably for years have gone dry entirely. The count is down. The ranch has been culling aggressively, selling cattle that should have been kept for breeding, shipping young steers that should have been held another year to gain weight, moving anything with value before conditions worsen. Grass is gone in the most exposed pastures. What grew in spring withered by June. Rain that should have come in July never arrived. August brought more heat and no relief. Pastures that were green in April are bare dirt by September. The herd that remains is thin. Ribs show on cattle that should be fat. Calves are underweight. Cows are dry, their milk gone, unable to support the calves they dropped in spring. The manager sits at the desk in the headquarters stone building. The windows are closed against dust, but dirt still finds its way inside. A fine layer coats every surface. The ledger is open in front of him. The columns are clear. Costs on the left, revenue on the right. The gap between them is widening. Costs are fixed. Payroll has to be met. The crew is already cut to minimum, but the remaining hands still draw wages. Taxes come due regardless of drought. The county does not care that grass is gone. Property tax bills arrive on schedule. Loan interest is another fixed cost. The ranch borrowed in previous years to fund improvements that looked wise when rain was normal. Wells, fences, equipment. The loans made sense then. Now the interest payments are a burden the ranch can barely carry. Supplies still cost money. Feed has to be purchased and hauled in for breeding stock the ranch cannot afford to lose. Veterinary costs continue. Equipment breaks and has to be repaired. Trucks need fuel. The small costs add up. Revenue column is short. Cattle sales brought less than projected. The Chicago price dropped just as the Matador herd went to market. Timing was unlucky. What should have been a break-even sale turned into a loss after shipping and commission fees. A decision is required. Borrow more and hope the drought breaks. Lenders are still willing, though terms are harder. Interest rates have climbed. The ranch's credit is still good, but not as strong as it was. More debt means more interest, another fixed cost stacked on top of existing obligations. If the next year is dry, the debt compounds. If the year after that is also dry, the interest payments grow larger than the operating income. The ranch spirals into insolvency, or, cut deeper now, accept pain immediately to avoid catastrophe later. Laying off more hands means slower response when conditions improve. Fewer cowboys means cattle are not gathered as thoroughly. Fence repairs lag. Water systems are not maintained as carefully. The ranch loses operational capacity that will be hard to rebuild. Selling more breeding stock means the herd shrinks below sustainable levels. When rain returns and grass grows back, the ranch will not have enough cattle to take advantage. Rebuilding takes years. Profits from recovery go to buying cattle instead of paying down debt or funding improvements. The manager chooses austerity. It is the only choice that offers a path through without betting everything on weather the ranch cannot control. Crews are reduced further. 2 more cowboys are let go. They are good hands, reliable men who have worked the ranch for years. The manager gives them severance and references and watches them ride out. The remaining crew works longer hours. Cowboys cover territories that used to require 2 men. They ride harder, work faster, and do without help that used to be standard. Non-essential repairs are deferred indefinitely. Fence that can wait another season waits. Wire that is stretched and sagging but still standing is left alone. Only breaks that allow cattle to drift are fixed immediately. Buildings that need paint or new roofs are ignored. The headquarters stone buildings are solid, but the frame structures are weathering badly. Roofs leak. Boards warp. None of it is fixed because there is no money and bigger problems demand attention. Some pastures are abandoned temporarily. Water has failed in divisions that were marginal even in wet years. Cattle are pulled out and concentrated where water still exists. Fences around those divisions are no longer maintained. The grass, what little exists, is left unused. The focus narrows to survival. Keep the core breeding stock alive. Keep the headquarters operational. Keep enough crew to function. Everything else is secondary. The weekly reports to Dundee during this period are bleak. Losses from drought, losses from low prices, borrowing to cover operating costs that should have been paid from revenue. The numbers are honest and they are grim. The drought lasts 3 more years. 1935 is dry. 1936 is worse. 1937 brings some rain, but not enough to fully break the drought. Recovery starts slowly in 1938. When rain finally comes in sufficient quantity, the ranch begins rebuilding, but the process is slow and painful. Wells that went dry during the drought have to be re-drilled. Some are drilled deeper and hit water. Others are abandoned and new sites are chosen. The cost of re-establishing reliable water across the ranch is staggering. Fences that were not maintained for years have to be rebuilt entirely. Wire that was stretched in the 1880s, patched repeatedly, and finally abandoned during the drought is beyond repair. New wire is purchased, and crews spend months refencing divisions. Cattle numbers take a decade to fully recover. The breeding stock that survived is bred carefully. Heifers are kept instead of sold. Bulls are purchased to maintain genetics and avoid inbreeding. The herd grows slowly, year by year, back toward pre-drought levels. But the ranch never reaches the size it had been. The drought forced permanent changes. Some divisions are never fully restocked. Some pastures are left at lower densities than before because the grass never fully recovered. The price line was crossed. The ranch survived by choosing which pain to accept and bearing it until conditions improved. Not every outfit made it through. Ranches that borrowed too heavily collapsed when they could not service debt. Ranches that refused to cut costs bled capital until they were forced to sell. Ranches that sold too much breeding stock could not rebuild when rain returned. The Matador survived because management made hard choices early and stuck with them. The drought was survived. The ranch endured. But the scars from those years never entirely faded. Chapter 15. Koch Era. Stewardship. The Koch family held the ranch for nearly 70 years, from 1952 to 2020. During that time, stewardship became the operating principle that defined how the ranch was managed. The land was not treated as a resource to be extracted and discarded. It was managed as a long-term asset that would produce indefinitely if cared for properly. Brush control kept mesquite from overwhelming pastures that had been cleared at great expense. Crews used a combination of mechanical, chemical, and fire-based methods to keep brush in check. Mesquite was cut and piled. Root plowing equipment ripped brush out of the ground. Herbicides were applied to stumps and sprouts. Prescribed burns cleared large areas efficiently. The work was constant. Mesquite never stopped trying to reclaim the range. Every year, new seedlings sprouted. Every year, crews had to respond. Brush control became a permanent line item in the budget, but it was necessary. Without it, the ranch would have reverted to thickets within a decade. Prescribed burns cleared dead growth and encouraged new grass. Fire was used strategically. Crews burned during specific seasons when conditions allowed control. Fire breaks were established. Equipment stood ready. Winds were monitored. Burns were conducted when weather was right and stopped when conditions shifted. The benefits were immediate and visible. Grass sprouted from burned ground within weeks if rain followed. Cattle grazed the new growth eagerly. Fire cleared accumulated litter that would otherwise choke grass and fuel wildfires. Water systems were upgraded continuously as technology improved. New wells were drilled using rotary rigs that could reach depths hand-dug wells never approached. Deep aquifers were tapped. Water that had been inaccessible became available. Pipelines replaced open ditches and reduced water loss to evaporation. Buried pipes distributed water across pastures with minimal waste. Troughs replaced natural springs where cattle had once concentrated and damaged fragile ecosystems. Erosion was monitored and corrected where it threatened range productivity. Gullies were stabilized with check dams and vegetation. Terraces were built on slopes to slow runoff. Cattle were moved before overgrazing could trigger erosion. The ranch treated soil as a resource that had to be protected. Wildlife management added a layer of complexity, but also revenue and positive publicity. Deer, quail, turkey, and other species were tracked through surveys and counts. Habitat improvements were made that benefited both wildlife and cattle. Brush management created edge habitat that supported more species. Water developments provided sources for wildlife as well as livestock. Hunting leases brought in revenue that supplemented cattle income. Wealthy sportsmen paid annual fees to hunt on the ranch. The fees were substantial and reliable. Hunters returned year after year. The income came without depleting the core cattle operation. The ranch marketed itself as a model of range stewardship and conservation. Articles appeared in agricultural journals and ranching magazines, highlighting Matador practices. Tours were offered to other ranchers and land managers who wanted to learn from the operation. Awards followed from ranching organizations and conservation groups. The ranch was recognized for sustainable management, wildlife habitat, and land stewardship. The publicity was valuable. It positioned the Koch-era Matador as a responsible steward, not just a cattle operation. That reputation mattered in an era when ranching faced increasing scrutiny from environmental groups and regulators. The remuda was maintained as a point of pride and practical necessity. Working horses were bred carefully. Bloodlines were selected for intelligence, soundness, and cow sense. Training programs ensured that horses were prepared for ranch work before being used in operations or sold. Awards came from breed associations. Matador horses were shown at competitions and consistently placed well. Buyers sought Matador-bred horses, knowing they had been raised for work, not show. The horses were also practical tools. Well-trained mounts made cowboys more effective. A good horse could work cattle better than any machine. The investment in the remuda paid back through improved operations. Revenue diversification continued as the ranch adapted to changing markets. Cow-calf operations remained the foundation. Cows dropped calves every spring. The calves were raised on grass, weaned in fall, and sold as yearlings or young stockers. This was traditional ranching, and it remained profitable when managed well. Horses added value through sales and through making ranch operations more efficient. A well-trained horse sold for good money. A herd of well-trained horses made the crew more productive. Hunting leases provided steady income that did not depend on cattle prices. Even when beef markets were poor, hunters still paid. The diversification smoothed revenue and reduced dependence on any single income source. Later, lodging and guest stays added another revenue stream. The headquarters stone buildings were impressive and historic. Guests paid to stay in renovations of the old bunkhouses or in newer lodges built to blend with the historic structures. They experienced ranch life, toured the operation, and left with stories and photographs. Weddings and events were hosted. The landscape was striking. The stone buildings provided a dramatic backdrop. Couples paid to hold ceremonies on the ranch. Corporate groups paid for retreats and team-building experiences. The operation stayed profitable without the boom and bust extremes of earlier eras. No distant shareholders demanding dividends regardless of drought. No pressure to expand beyond sustainable levels. No financial engineering or speculative ventures. The ranch operated as a ranch, producing cattle and diversifying income in ways that made sense. The Koch family ran it conservatively and successfully for 7 decades. But by 2020, the family decided to sell. Not because the operation was failing. The ranch was productive and profitable, not because the land was degraded. Stewardship practices had maintained and in some cases improved range quality. The next generation had different plans. Business interests lay elsewhere. The ranch, for all its history and success, was no longer central to family strategy. It was time to find new owners who would continue the work. The decision was practical and unsentimental. The ranch had been an asset. Now it would be sold. What mattered was finding buyers who would steward the land responsibly. Chapter 16. Collier Consolidation, 2020. The listings went public in late summer. Approximately 131,000 acres of remaining Texas Matador holdings were marketed as a package for roughly $124.45 million. The offering included the traditional headquarters where the stone buildings still stood, key divisions with developed water and good grass, and the Flying V brand rights for the purchased parcels. The marketing materials emphasized stewardship, decades of range management, award-winning remuda, hunting and wildlife habitat, infrastructure that had been maintained and improved. This was not distressed property being dumped. This was a premium ranch being offered to buyers who could afford quality. Sales occurred in stages over 2020 and into 2021. Different parcels attracted different buyers. Some divisions were purchased by neighboring ranches that wanted to expand. Others went to new owners who planned to operate them independently. But the Collier family emerged as the primary acquirer. They purchased a large portion of the holdings, including the headquarters division. The acquisition consolidated multiple parcels under a single ownership structure. The Collier family intended to continue operating the land as the Matador Ranch, preserving the name and the continuity. The Collier era began in 2021. The ranch continues under new ownership, but with explicit ties to the historic name and legacy. Cattle still graze the Pease River breaks. The Flying V still marks hides. The stone headquarters, built in 1917, still anchors operations. What changed is ownership structure and scale. The Scottish Empire phase ended in 1951. The Koch corporate era ended in 2021. The Collier family now holds what remains, operating it as a working ranch with conscious connection to the past. This is the afterlife of the Matador. Not abandonment, not ruin, not even transformation into something unrecognizable. A reduced but functional continuation. The operation persists in semi-consolidated form under owners who chose to preserve the name and honor the history. The ambiguity that has always surrounded the Matador remains. Is this success? The ranch has survived 3 distinct ownership eras spanning nearly 150 years. The land is still productive. The brand still carries meaning. Operations continue. Or is this evidence that no cattle empire lasts unchanged, that scale and ambition eventually contract, that what once stretched across millions of acres now fits within a few 100,000? The answer depends on what you measure. If legacy means the brand still burns on hides and the name still commands respect, the Matador endures. If legacy means the original Scottish structure intact and the multi-region empire still functioning, the Matador is long gone. If legacy is the land still being worked, still producing cattle, still part of the panhandle economy, then continuity holds, and the Matador survives in its most fundamental form. The breaks are still there. Red canyons carved by the Pease River, springs seeping through stone, grass that greens after rain and cures, standing through drought. The grass still grows, the wind still blows. Cowboys still ride fence and gather cattle and repair what breaks. The Matador Ranch is not frozen in 1882 when Dundee merchants bought a frontier partnership. It is not frozen in 1952 when Fred Koch incorporated a private company. It is not frozen in 2021 when the Collier family consolidated the remaining divisions. It is what it has always been: land, cattle, water, labor, and the constant negotiation between what the landscape offers and what human ambition demands. The negotiation between capital and climate, between vision and reality, between what can be controlled and what cannot. That negotiation continues under the Collier family, just as it did under Koch management, just as it did under Mackenzie's guidance, just as it did when Campbell and Britton first claimed range at Ballard Springs. The Matador has outlasted every person who ever owned it. It has outlasted every structure imposed on it. It has outlasted boom and bust, drought and flood, open range and fenced pasture, Scottish capital and American corporations. What remains is the land and the work, the land that never promised to be easy or forgiving, the work that never promised to make anyone rich or safe, and the choice made over and over by people who decided that working this particular ground was worth the cost.